This meeting is being recorded.
Greetings, everyone. My name is DJ Wells. I'm the Executive Director of the Mensah Research Institute, and you've joined us for another in our series of webinars that stem from the exciting start that we got back in October with the Integrative Mental Health Summit. These webinars that we're hosting every month are continuing that conversation. We are doing these with our good friends from Journey's Dream. And I remind you that should you want, I'll remind you again at the end, but should you want to revisit this conversation, if this conversation is so enthralling that you want to go through it again, a video replay will be made available on Amity, which is Journey's Dream's online mental health support network. We'll give you some more information about that towards the end. As you saw in the advertisements leading up to this conversation this evening, when we had Dr. Mike Lukens with us a few weeks ago, the conversation between Dr. Lukens and Dr. Mensah was extremely well received. And so we've decided to continue that conversation a little bit. And today we want to focus specifically on anxiety. The conversation last time was where the brain meets the mind, and we're going to continue that conversation, but we're going to focus specifically on anxiety this time. I want to remind you that if you've got questions, please use the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, probably at the top of your screen if you're on a mobile device. Type in your question, and as we get towards the end of our session today, I'll feed those questions to Dr. Lukens and to Dr. Mensah. And so without any further ado, I'll turn the computer podium over to Dr. Mensah and Dr. Lukens. Dr. Mensah, you want to get us started?
Certainly. Thank you, Ms. Wells, and thank you, Dr. Lukens, for joining in the conversation and being an integral part. I want to share with everyone that the whole point of these conversations is really that as we at Mensah Medical and Orthomolecular Medicine have a particular vantage point, we look at issues that were normally called or formerly called psychiatric or psychological issues from a biochemical perspective. In other words, there's something physiologically or biochemically or genetically different with that individual that leads to the expression of these symptoms. We also recognize that that too is not all encompassing and complete. And so we turn to a true pioneer in this field, Dr. Mike Lukens, with discussion of what the mind is doing and how it works in its perception, as we really try to integrate both aspects of and both approaches to these conditions. So we thought it would be great to start with an integrated look at anxiety. We understand it to be biochemical reactions gone wrong. Dr. Mike Lukens, on the other hand, has a bit of a different perspective and a different side to the equation that we'd like him to share. So Mike, why don't we just take it from there?
Sure. So I'm on the mind side of the fence, trained as a clinical psychologist, practiced for 30 some years. So the brain has been interesting, but the mind has really been more my focus. And so when I look to explain things like anxiety, I don't suggest that there isn't biochemical elements that obviously play an important role. But when I sit with a client, I'm interacting essentially through conversation. And so what this means is we're engaged mind to mind. And so if in fact, a person woke up tomorrow and the first time in their life they had a panic attack, there would be an explanation of the physiological aspects that their treating professional may have in mind, particularly if they're going to look for some pharmaceutical kinds of interventions or what have you. But what the person needs at that moment is something that satisfies their mind's need for understanding and explanation. And in fact, if you made up something that sounded kind of reasonable, you could probably calm them down with it, even if it was totally made up. A little like you can imagine a child that has some fears and some insecurities somehow getting comforted by a stuffed animal. And so this is happening in the realm of their mind, in the realm of their emotioning, as I call it. And it is crucial, even after you found a kind of medical intervention that might help the person, it's kind of crucial that they have an explanation that sort of satisfies them. So, what's causing this, doctor? And you give them an explanation. And the truth is, you could make one up as long as you sound like you know what you're talking about. And they may be reassured by it. On the other hand, you may give them all the facts you know, and that might leave skeptical, and they're going to go get a second opinion, a third opinion, a fourth opinion. So somebody gives them the opinion that their mind is actually searching for. So there are some people that would believe in a religious or spiritual explanation of why they have this anxiety or this fear. It actually depends on the shape of the mind of the person as they encounter this issue, this problem, or your effort to help them. So having sort of seen this, perspective, seen anxiety and fear from this perspective, I've come to a collection of conclusions that I think are kind of unusual, like they're a little bit different. So maybe if I could take a couple minutes and go over some of that might help. Do I have the opportunity to share my screen here? How does that work on this setup?
Yes, you can share the screen.
Like everybody can do that? Okay, so I'm just gonna do that and try and call this up here. There's two things I want to share visually. Screen one, yeah, that's what we want. All right, what are you guys seeing on your screen? Because I have two screens here.
We have the emotioning circuit.
Okay, you can see that, good. So this is a little graph that I put together, and it's actually in the book too, but a little complicated. You see down the bottom, the object. So the person sort of perceiving or encountering some object, something, it could be an abstraction even, but it's in the world, they perceive it. And what I've done is I've sort of put the brain and its structures on the inside, and I put the mind and its structures on the outside. So as perception happens, the body, largely from the standpoint of the nervous system and the brain, is responding. The mind is also responding. And they are kind of doing this together. In other words, there's a jolt of something coming through the various, sensory pathways. And what you can sort of recognize is that, it might begin at the finger, or begin at the eye, or begin at the nose, and it works its way up into the cortex and into the brain. And in essence, what's happening at the point of perception is the mind is asking the question, what is this? The brain is busy processing the sensory input, and the mind is charged with the task of making sense of what the brain is sensing. So we have sensory sensing, and we have making sense of sensing. Now, if a person can't make sense of it, they will continue, if it's the least bit significant or important, they will continue to churn inside their mind trying to make sense of it. When they make sense of it, the mind actually, in a sense, draws a conclusion about it. Ah, that's what that is. That's what that means. That's the point in time in this process at which the mind and the brain together are sending to what I refer to as the will, the marching orders for the actions to be taken, for the efferent, what's coming out from the mind and the brain in order to move the body into action. So if you think about the patellar reflex, that's where you cross your, you know what it is, but it's where you stick your knee out there and the doctor says relax and he taps it in that special spot with the hammer. And what he does is he triggers the reflex arc so that the input from the banging on the nerve ending from the hammer goes to the motor circuits in the brain and bypasses the mind. And so the leg moves without the will being involved. So we think of that as object encountered, messages in a sense going through the afferent pathways, coming right out the efferent side on the other end of this process. Immediately, the mind's uninvolved in that particular behavior. If in fact I hit somebody's leg and I miss that spot, I'm going to get a lot of mind activity. And the leg might move, but it will willfully move to kick me. Very, very different process. So when there is something that is vegetative and doesn't involve the mind, we don't have the conversation, we don't have the analysis, we don't have the sorting of the input that involves our consciousness, or it involves even our subconscious awareness. When our subconscious or conscious awareness is involved, the mind gets involved, the knee could get tapped, and who knows, in a sense, what's going to come out of the mind in terms of the conclusion and the behaviors. So that's just a quick and easy illustration of the distinction. So I've been so bold as to put it this way that I don't think there's any such thing as anxiety. I think we made up the idea because it was difficult to explain some of our fears. It's difficult to explain them to ourselves. It's difficult to explain someone else's fears. In the absence of the explanation for it, I wouldn't say I have grizzly bear anxiety if a grizzly bear was chasing me down the street. I would say I have fear of being eaten or mauled. If there was no physical grizzly bear there and I had like an eerie feeling that there might be, then somebody's going to call that anxiety because they don't recognize any legitimate source that would trigger fear. But that could be an internal trigger. In other words, I may just formed an image of the time I saw the grizzly bear because the grizzly bear was standing next to a tree that looked a lot like the tree that's right in front of me. And so that memory, in a sense, that partial memory triggers the recognition of that moment of trauma, which then generates the fear response. But because we're a little confused or fuzzy about what triggered it and why then, we might refer to that as anxiety. So this leads me to the conclusion that there's really no such thing as anxiety as much as there is the situation where we have fears that we're a little fuzzy about. And so in the work that I do, I assume there is a trigger and that it's got reality basis for that person somewhere in relation to them in their mind, but not being able to detect the threads and the source that the threads are connected to, the person's sort of short on explanation and short on understanding. And then anxiety is the cover word for those fears that we can't otherwise explain to ourselves. I help people figure out what their fears are and then relate to the fear as something that can be addressed as a fear with some certainty about cause and effect and the links between the perception, the experience, and the sense of fear, and then the impulse to behave in relation to it. So that's kind of a nutshell description of the difference of, in terms of my take on anxiety.
Dr. Mensah?
Well, that's it. Yes, that's a very interesting descriptive way of putting it. And it kind of makes one think, as we were just starting on the subject, I began to consider different aspects of that sensation, that feeling. And you put it nicely in the diagram, what are afferent and efferent really refers to what is from within going out and what is coming back from outside to within. And in that framework, there's oftentimes cause and then response. So what happens is that a lot of times our anxiety is triggered. We would say there's a trigger. What that trigger really is there's a cause, and then the response is anxiety or depression or whatever else somebody is feeling. But the question is, why do you get triggered in the first place? And at a certain point in time, this becomes a reflex. And as Dr. Lukens pointed out, when the doctor taps your knee with a hammer and it goes boing, that is an automated response, a reflex created by a particular trigger. And it becomes automated. What happens over time with many forms of anxiety is that when the mind perceives a particular trigger, it then reflexively allows for the emotional response, or the brain does, and Mike can correct me here, of anxiety. So then you become automated and acclimated to this particular response when presented with the same trigger, if that trigger has not been either deconstructed, reconstructed, sincerely evaluated, and dealt with by the other mechanisms present, namely the mind or the brain, or in some cases the body. So there's an initial, and I think, Mike, there's a question when we talk about an initial process for anxiety versus the reflexive process of anxiety. How do we get from point A to point B, and how do we undo it? How do we break that reflex arc?
Yeah. Well, again, you know, the mind is a pretty complex phenomenon. And one of the things that I have, you know, recognized about the mind, it can play tricks on us, particularly if we're in favor of having it play tricks on us. And so what I mean by that is fear motivates avoidance. The experience of fear behaviorally motivates avoidance. Here's the threat, avoid the threat. Now, when I have a fear that's free floating like that, and I don't see the threat, you see where my avoidance doesn't know how to be applied. What do I avoid? What am I trying to avoid? I don't know, because I don't know what the threat really is at that point. I may have an inkling, I might have some information, but again, it's partially fuzzy to me. There's no clarity. I'm not unclear about the physical grizzly bear, right? Like, what are you afraid of? Like, nobody's going to ask me, what are you afraid of at that point? Except for maybe, you know, the zoo trainer who knows that, well, this is the cutest little bear, wouldn't hurt a soul. But he's possessing, you know, special information. So when I don't know what the trigger really consists of, I don't know how to avoid, or even if necessary, turn and attack the threat. I'm punching at a ghost. I'm hitting my head. I don't know where I should direct my behavioral energies to help me with that situation. As a result, our default usually is, well, let me get rid of the experience then. The threat is there. I don't quite make it out clearly. It triggers the fear response. And I'm busy trying to manage the fear response rather than the threat that the fear response is responding to. As a result of this, I become part of my own problem. And so when you talk about this thing becoming a reflex art, part of the reason it becomes a reflex art is because I'm not interested in reflecting upon it when it happens.
Yes.
I should be looking for more data. I'm looking for less. I partly author my own fuzziness this way with my defensive strategy being that impulse to move away from my fear if I possibly can. So if somebody was on an airplane and they were a seasoned pilot and there was some, different arrangement, different cockpit, different, dials and, the control panel is not the same. And they hear an alarm. There's a signal. The pilot is going to try to find the alarm in order to discern what the alarm is signaling. Somebody else might just hit the alarm with a hammer because they can't stand the sound of it. That's how we relate to our anxiety. That's the problem. I should pause, I should study, I should reflect, I should look at all the dials and all the info related to, but I'm annoyed by the alarm and I'm alarmed by the alarm. And so I take a hammer and smash the alarm and of course the plane crashes.
So in other words,
that plane crashes. Now I know I should be afraid of flying.
Dr. Lukens, we actually just had a question come in that very much relates to this. So I'm going to jump in with an audience question earlier than I might have otherwise. But one of our viewers is asking if people often experience anxiety because they're overwhelmed by all the stimuli that they're facing. And so the question is, are they afraid simply because their brain or their mind can't keep up with all of that input?
Absolutely. So think about control and the need for control as it operates in the middle of all this. So, again, I'm the seasoned pilot, but I don't really know this cockpit, but the alarm goes off. I know the drill, I know what to do. Now, if there's 17 alarms going off at once, even though I'm a seasoned pilot, it's like, which one? And, there will be this sense of loss of control, which relates to the idea that even if I find out what the threat is, I may be impotent and unable to do anything about it. So you have fear happening on two different levels. So, do we feel a need to have control over ourselves? You're damn right we do. And we don't recognize it until, in fact, the control is taken away or threatened itself. So think about it. I have the threat, and control, in a sense, is my meta tool. This is the thing that will allow me to find the tools that I need to handle. And if I don't have control, it's like somebody took my whole toolbox. So now I'm not just afraid of the grizzly bear. I'm afraid, who took my gun? Like, where's that? I no longer have the control that I was counting on. And this is what panic attacks do for people in such a, dramatic and traumatic way. Anybody, let's just say we're all control freaks, different flavors, different levels of intensity. We all like to have some control. Maybe the Buddha didn't care about control. That was his brilliance. But the rest of us are needing control. And in fact, operationally, I don't actually think we have control. What we have is a sense of some control. When we're participating in our own lives and in our own mission-driven movement through our own spaces, we are deciding autonomously what to do next, what to do next, what to do next. We feel like we're deciding autonomously what this is, what that is, and what it means. The minute that gets disrupted on some level, my sense of control is threatened. I go reaching for something. So this is the paradox for me that's inside the paradox. I go reaching for control when I don't have it. Since I don't ever really have it, anytime I'm reminded of that, I can have a real existential crisis. Like it's almost like I see an unpredictable, acorn falling out of a tree, and next thing you know, I got the whole sky falling on top of me in my mind. Like, well, that's irrational. Why did you go there with that? Well, that's what happens. The threat, my normal sense of control, the fear, I can't even get rid of the fear. I can't handle the thing that's threatening me. Next thing you know, I have a sense of no defense against anything. And kind of like just sort of generalizes like a spike. And then the panic. Now I'm seeking control when I feel it being stripped away from me completely. So whatever the threat was initially, now we have sort of a meta threat of you have just lost the one thing that you need in life, which is your control.
And that's a very important point there. Control. And when you don't have that control, which in a sense is your armor, your processing armor capacity,
That's right.
you now have the experience of vulnerability.
Yep.
And when there's vulnerability, there too begins the ongoing downward spiral that can lead to panic. And I'm glad you brought up that piece, Mike, because when we talk about certain chemistries, right, there's a predilection for individuals who are undermethylated in chemistry to be highly perfectionistic, controlling individuals who seek to organize the world around them. And they function optimally when all their little parameters all line up appropriately.
Yeah.
But remove one strand from the equation and displace it, and you can begin to start to see them unravel. This is very classic for our undermethylated individuals who have not just panic, not just anxiety, but who may develop OCD tendencies.
Yeah, exactly.
For those individuals who got even ADHD early in childhood. But the alcoholics, the gamblers, many people who get addicted on other forms of drugs, much of this goes back to the feeling of a sense of lack of control. And now they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so we begin to see this domino effect. Some handle it better than others do. But vulnerability, I think, is a very linchpin key mechanism or part of this equation that we don't recognize.
Yes.
And as you said, Mike, people run from the stimuli instead of sitting down to analyze and try to go directly into the hurricane, so to speak.
Sure.
Folks,
Yeah.
you all don't know this, but Dr. Lukens was a pioneer a few years ago, maybe, 10 years, Mike, when you wrote your first book. And one of his constructs was exactly shifting from the field of psychology and psychiatry traditionally, which was don't run from the hurricane, I'm paraphrasing, run towards the hurricane, go to the center of the hurricane, and realize that it's just a small wind and not the hurricane storm that you're seeking or that you believe is there. And in other words, moving towards the problem and trying to sit with it and analyze it. And so, Mike, first of all, I thank you for that paradigm way back when, and sharing that with our groups today. It's important that we recognize where many of our routine behaviors are coming from and where they're taking us, namely down the wrong path. Please continue, Mike. I sort of jumped in there.
No, that's good. And vulnerability, if you think about it, I know I have no defense. That's what vulnerability really means. When I'm willfully vulnerable, I'm having defenses that I, shut down. So I still feel like I have some control over them and intimacy, right? So that's like selected vulnerability. When I otherwise feel vulnerability as if somebody took my defenses from me. And in that particular case, free-floating fear is almost guaranteed. I feel my right flank exposed. I feel my left flank exposed. So I often, I kind of puzzled about whether dogs feel shame. And I was thinking about, when they're kind of indisposed, going to the bathroom. And so that, for a human, we'd have our body modesty and, we'd feel the need for some privacy or what have you. And I don't think that's what the dog has going on. And so it occurred to me that really what must be happening for the dog is in that process, all his muscles in his body and the positioning and whatnot is leaving him vulnerable to attack. So that would be the one moment he let it. He's kind of like letting his guard down, but he's looking around. He's not looking around to see who's to feel shame. He's looking around to see who might be attacking. So that vulnerability, by definition, again, when we feel like we have some control over whether we're vulnerable or not, think about that. Like, how vulnerable are you if you're like only allowing half of it, So, and people in intimate relationships will say that kind of thing to each other, like, I'm really here. You don't seem like you're really present. Where are you or whatever? Well, maybe I'm lost in thought, or maybe my defenses are still up a little bit. When my defenses are taken from me against my will, or not, that I'm not willfully participating in it, that is an invitation to have generalized fear about almost anything and everything. It's like the mind will kick in and say, what could get me? It's like I'm asking the question already. So I'm left, undefended with this, like the spider sense of what could be out there looking to get me, a little like the dog going to the bathroom. So vulnerability does play into this. But vulnerability, then, we look at this, it's actually a real threat. Vulnerability itself is a threat. So the panic attack, if you think about it, being the quintessential, out of control fear experience, think about what the person that has a panic attack will verbalize, that they're afraid of, what's happening. They're afraid of fainting in public. Like, a lot of them will say they're afraid of fainting in public. But you do feel like, you're getting tingly, you're hyperventilating, all that stuff is going on. And I'm going to be vulnerable, beyond belief, dependent on the kindness of strangers, so to speak. And that is what? It's not like, but I won't kill you necessarily. What would happen? Again, they don't want to examine a hurricane at its source, or a tornado at its source. They want to run away from it. And seeking the control over this at that moment in time is exactly the wrong thing to do. It only exacerbates your situation. So, you have somebody having a panic attack, you shoot them with something that's going to force them to relax. That makes some sense, because if you tell them to relax, you're probably going to heighten their frenzy, because you point out that they have no control by doing that.
If I can jump in here with another pertinent question to this particular part of the conversation. One of our good friends, Dr. Brown down in Florida, there with you, Mike, is asking about at what point do we learn to control our mind when we have life experiences to draw from? That vulnerability often is fed by things that have happened to us in the past. Shouldn't we be learning from our past experiences rather than, or how do we learn from our past experiences without being overcome by that anxiety?
Well, that's the catch-22 of it, like I was trying to point out. So think about trauma. Trauma of any kind creates anxiety, right? Because there's fear of this, that, and 17 other things that I can't even list them. So at the same time, my whole commitment emotionally to dealing with this is to try to run away from it. Nobody who gets traumatized says within a week or two, or a month or two, or a year or two, I think it's time for me to turn and face all these demons. So the learning that could take place is never given the opportunity to take place. Think of it, trauma is like one trial non-learning. That's really what it is. Not one trial learning, one trial non-learning. You have the trial, it's still ongoing. Are you going to learn about this? Or are you going to be playing hooky inside your mind for the rest of your life? So when I do trauma work, I put people in touch with the elements they've been avoiding. Now I do this, I don't do it in a camouflage way. I do it explicitly. I tell it's informed consent. This is what we're going to do. We're going to re-explore that experience. One of the the rules of thumb I completely disagree with. There's this fear of re-traumatizing somebody. And my point is, I'm not re-traumatizing them. I'm getting them to fully experience the trauma that they already had, because their avoidance of their experience is keeping them information deprived, that no progress can happen as long as they're avoidant. Now, it's very hard to take somebody that's like, really committed to avoiding and saying, why don't you turn and face this? So in general, this doesn't happen like one giant cathartic experience. It's like, can you look at this piece? I can look at that piece. Can you look at that piece? Yeah, but I can't look at the two middle ones. All right, we'll come back to them. But already we got some looking, we got some learning, we got some information coming in, we got some opening. Now, they surrendered some control there. I didn't ask them to surrender it all, in a way that would completely overwhelm them. But I got to stretch their comfort zone, because their comfort zone will always keep them on the safe side, avoiding anything having to do with the trauma. And if you look at the definition of trauma technically, like one of the primary symptoms is, I avoid anything that reminds me of it. So, okay, I guess we won't be studying it anytime soon, will we? And we need to study it. We need to inquire into it. We need to deconstruct it, like you said, Albert. We need to take it apart. And we can either do it piecemeal, or we can do it in chunks, or it can happen somewhat haphazardly. But in the end, the learning won't take place as long as avoidance is the mission.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, Mike, that makes so clearly, very poignant, the whole idea that this is why so many people have triggers. They never addressed the initial insult.
Right.
And so they continue to re-experience only part of the equation,
Yeah.
and veer off in a different direction,
Yeah.
as opposed to having sort of analyzed, come to a point of understanding, and move beyond to the healing point.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it's just very interesting when we just kind of take, for example, the old paradigm, Mike, as you brought up, which is, we don't want people to re-experience the trauma. And maybe it's not so much re-experiencing the trauma as opposed to looking to dissociate the emotional response from the actual technical piece that happened,
Yeah.
and trying to heal by way of understanding it and moving in that direction.
Yeah.
We deal with all once again, the biochemistry that kind of sits around it.
Yeah.
But that approach is very important. Now, many people say some traumas really don't need to be relived, but I think that certain traumas do need to be understood. And I'm certainly not a therapist, Mike. I don't get into your world in this way. But when a husband and a wife have a certain level of pathological or challenging, shall we say, interactive capacity, we see men shutting down, seeking to avoid that which seems to be creating a difficulty with his spouse. And in many respects, we're not really trying to understand what that challenge or difficulty is, because we think that it makes us either vulnerable, or it's beyond our capacity, our will, our strength at the moment to address the issue. But we step away from it, and the issue continues to perpetuate. It
Right.
manifests in different ways because it was never addressed. And sometimes that's what our spouses are really trying to tell us. We need to address the issue, don't be avoidant. And this is where their strength comes out. And far too many of us start to cower at that point.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't solve the problem. And it's a different vantage point, a different example, but the foundational pieces are still the same. The avoidance leads to this ongoing fire that gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, we're awfully avoidant, and I do think when it comes to all things emotional, men just the culture of maleness, we are much more prone to avoid. The male rule of thumb: if you can't cure it, kill it. If you can't kill it, ignore it. It'll go away. And so there's avoidance. There's like quick problem solving, and if that doesn't work, then the hell with it. It's gotten too nebulous. It's gotten too fuzzy, and I don't want to deal with it. And yeah, so why do we have to, in that, particular situation, what moves us to feel uncomfortable about what's happening in the moment? And I would suggest that 9 times out of 10, we're talking about low-level shame. So, I'm a man, I'm supposed to have answers. You give me all the questions I can answer, I'm happy. You start to give me questions I can't answer, shut up and let's move on. And so I'm talking to my wife, and she's got all sorts of questions and issues and things that I have no answer for. And I'm supposed to sit there in my incapacity to help, to know, to problem solve, and be okay with myself. And it starts to sort of grate away at that sense of self-esteem because of how we've defined it. Now, you're a doctor, you're supposed to know everything, right, Albert?
Oh, most things.
Well, so but what they say is true. The wiser a man gets, the more he knows that there's stuff he doesn't know. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's just true. It's humbling, but it's true. And so, there's my wife, and she obviously needs something from me, and she's in distress. And I already know I'm going to fail because this is not my arena. I got no expertise, So now I'm the guy in the cockpit that has no idea how to fly a plane. There's 17 alarms going off. I just want to take out a gun and shoot all the alarms, or a hammer and smash them all, because I'm in over my head and I'm feeling my inadequacy. So when men can come to terms with that, like be okay with that sense of not having the answer, being inadequate to the task, likely going to fail, all right, bring it on. Let's roll up our sleeves and get dirty. Let's get in there. And
I didn't mean to.
well, no, but as a therapist, I've had to learn to do that over and over and over again. A distressed person sitting in front of me wanting quick fixes and immediate answers, I don't have them. They're going to be dissatisfied. If I take it upon myself to be the answer man, I'm in trouble. At some point along the line, I recognize I'm not the answer man, I'm the question guy. My job is to help people form better questions, not have answers.
I didn't mean this to come down to relationships or relationship conversations, but so many of the things that you bring up, Mike, kind of remind me of what we hear quite a bit, which is that many times men in this avoidant capacity, because they're assuming that someone is broaching them with a situation that they're supposed to resolve, and they don't feel they have the capacity to resolve it, and so they avoid it. What's very interesting is that when communication finally happens, what they find out is that this individual simply wanted them to listen and not solve the problem, but just to hear them. And you hear, forgive me, I'm not being sexist, but you hear women say that a lot with regard to their significant others, their spouses. It says, he won't listen, and all I wanted him to do was to hear me. And he's thinking, wow, that's all she wanted. And all this time I was thinking she wanted me to fix this problem that I don't feel I have the capacity to fix. But if we had gone and looked into the storm to begin with, sometimes we would have saved ourselves decades literally, of disharmonious
unnecessary conflict.
Unnecessary conflict.
So the male that has the quick answer thinks he's being helpful, and he has no idea he's insulting her.
Yes.
Like he's stating the obvious as if he's helpful. Why don't you just quit the job? And she's like, you don't like your boss, quit the job. And women are more comfortable with their ambivalence. And I think there's a biological reason for that. I don't think it's just sexism or culture. Obviously, biology influences culture and what have you. But a woman has to be able, as a mother, has to be able to read the cues of a nonverbal creature. And she stands there knowing this is important because there's distress. There's an immediate demand in her system to find the answer and solve it. And she's willing to hang out with that chaos and the ambivalence because it's required of her in the moment. So she just does it. And the guy gets in there and he'll end up, spanking the child or covering their mouth, or, like he's frenzied and he's failing and he's not getting it right. And he's like, deal with the ambivalence, deal with the ambiguity, deal with the uncertainty. No, I hate that. And, when you were describing the folks with the deficit, OCD-like symptoms because of it, think about it. Anything less than absolute clarity and order is going to make me fidgety. Well, then you're not going to be good in a relationship. Because they're so messy and ambiguous and, hard to pin down and shape-shifting, and it's going to be very difficult. So, I need a Stepford partner. I got to fit into the mold and behave perfectly and not disturb my internal sense of order. So men would be well served just randomly studying people's ambivalence and their own ambivalence, hanging out with the uncertainty.
And one for the moms out there. So when you ask your husband to take care of the kids for a while you step out, tell them you're actually helping them with therapy in the unknown.
Exactly.
And the more comfortable they become within the vortex of 3 or 4 children between the ages of 11 and 2, all running through the hurricane of the house with chores and homework and so forth, while the missus, who has become seasoned in all of this chaos, takes a break. Tell him it's training for his future job.
That's it.
Help him climb the corporate ladder.
It'll make him better at everything in life, is what it boils down to.
Absolutely, absolutely. As we're moving on here,
we'll call it chaos training.
Chaos training. Fabulous, fabulous. I can't wait to get the letters at this point in time, the emails. Did you tell my wife about chaos training in that seminar? Or the spouse in the other direction. What was my husband talking about with this chaos therapy? And he's going out for a beer instead of helping with the kids. Mike, we have this anxiety. Now, what steps do we take to really begin to move in this direction of healing? We've kind of talked around it, but let's get directly to it.
Yeah.
How do we really shift, retrain ourselves, move in the right direction here?
And Dr. Lukens, before you answer that question, let me inject a biochemical question that was posed a little bit earlier that might speak to this. When you were speaking before of folks becoming overwhelmed, they can't keep up with the inputs, from the biochemical side, certainly one of the things that we're working on is helping the brain function better. So does improving our ability to process information more efficiently help to eliminate some of the anxiety and fear?
It does, but I think it's more of an issue of willingness than efficient information processing. If we trusted our mind for its ultimate capacity to process things, we wouldn't be blocking off access to dissonant or uncomfortable information automatically. And so, the recognition that a lot of our learning takes place in the middle of an ordeal or stress, that's sort of a given that we don't recognize. We think learning should happen in a comfortable and easy sort of fashion when I'm open-minded and untroubled. And that would be great if it was reality, but it's not reality. A lot of the important lessons of life are happening in the middle of, great overwhelm, great confrontation, great stress. And these are the important, self and character shaping lessons. So if we play hooky with the education that life is trying to give us, we will pay a price. We will pay a price. And if I go ahead,
Mike. I'm sorry.
Well, so I can take, the nootropics and, try and sharpen my mind and everything else. But the minute I get afraid I'm going to run away from it, doesn't matter what I've done, in terms of improving information processing in a vacuum. So really what's required here is a kind of understanding of what the emotions are about, what they mean, what they're really requiring of us, and we don't necessarily read or understand the memo that they're trying to send us. Again, I get back to the cockpit when the alarm goes off. What is that about? If I set my own alarm, so I go to bed at night, I set my own alarm, and I have to get up in the morning to do something I'm not at all looking forward to. I set the alarm goes off. I hate my alarm. Like I have a reaction to my alarm. So I set my alarm. I've got a great vacation that I'm, going to embark on tomorrow. The alarm goes off. I might wake up in a great mood. I might kiss the alarm, like, thank you so much. So when we strip our experience of life from an understanding of what's going on for us emotionally, we deserve the confusion that we've created, and we will pay for it. So think about, again, we'll do this in terms of a little bit of gender differences. Think about the typical macho guy's relationship to his fear. Is he allowed to have fear? Is his manhood threatened by his fear? What are the odds if a very natural fear comes up for him, he's going to deny it? He's going to run away from the fear. He's going to disclaim it. So when you see somebody like that have a panic attack, you feel bad for the, like, it's really falling apart for you, isn't it, dude? Because I need that control, and it's related to my self-image and my self-esteem, and I get shamed just by being afraid. And if I was in the schoolyard and they saw me, I'd get teased, and working themselves up into this whirlwind of mixed emotions, running from it at every turn because it's in that realm of feeling. It's in that realm of uncertainty about what my response is made of. What does it consist of? So let's talk about this process of intervening. So I don't think there's a thing called anxiety. So I know the word is used and it's understood. So it's not like I don't use the word. Ghosts don't exist, but I use the word and we traffic in the concepts. So somebody says, what do you think about ghosts? I mean, I know the word, I know what they mean by it. And I say, they don't exist. Now let's talk about them, right? Okay. So anxiety doesn't exist, so let's talk about it. Anxiety, if we're going to be successful in eliminating anxiety, we have to recognize the source of the fear. I can't do anything about a threat that I don't have any chance of identifying. I can't locate it. If I can't locate the threat, I can't locate safety in relation to the threat. Now, if I say to myself, I only want to live in a safe place no matter what, and I'm going to disclaim anything that makes me feel unsafe, I will never find a safe place. So think about the person who has a generalized anxiety disorder. I am only going to be okay when I'm in a perfectly safe place, and I got to be there long enough to feel it. Never happens for them because they're vigilant to what might be disturbing of their peace. They're actually inviting a recognition of the very information they're trying to run away from. The dog chasing and catching its own tail and biting it and wonder where the pain came from. That's what we do. That's what anxiety as an idea leads us to do. It's no wonder we reach for the heavy duty medication or, the illicit drug to calm us down. So can you see my screen? You see the screen? Yeah.
Yes.
So, you mentioned the idea of deconstruction. This is what I think is required. So I can be afraid of a grizzly bear. I can be afraid of my fear. I can be afraid of the grizzly bear, and I can be afraid of my fear of the grizzly bear at the same time. I can be afraid of my fear because, like the macho guy, it could be related to shame. So a grizzly bear shows up, and I not only have to worry about the grizzly bear eating me, I have to worry about the shame potential of how I dance with my fear. So I have two threats where everyone else has one. How do I hide from my shame? How do I avoid my shame? I've got to disclaim my fear. What kind of problem solving am I going to be able to do in the face of my fear and the real threat if I'm preoccupied with managing the shame component? So I have this image. I share this with clients. You know, we're in a room, it's mixed company, you know, women and children, myself. And somebody says, you know, bomb, there's a bomb. Now, we don't sit there and reflect on whether or not this is dangerous. We spring into impulsive action. We don't get to negotiate whether or not fear gets triggered. It's already triggered. The bomb, the minute that sound hits my ear, gets translated into what it means, the fear is already triggered. So this is not a reflex arc because meaning had to be established, but it was instantaneous that happened. Bomb, danger, legs, go. I start running to the door. As I get toward the door, my mind flashes to a scenario of me being the first one on the other side of the door with women and children still in the room. So what do? I slow down at the door and I get aggravated with everybody who's moving slowly. Have you seen any evidence of my shame yet? It's in my irritability. It was in my slowing down. I didn't really want to slow down because I want to be safe, but I don't want to be ashamed. I have ambivalence at the doorway. What I do with my ambivalence is I take it out on everybody who's moving too slow for me. They want to sort of thank me and acknowledge me for slowing down. And I'm not going to tell them the truth. I may not tell myself the truth. The truth for me might be too dissonant. I can't handle my own truth. Why'd you slow down, Mike? Well, I saw myself on the other side of the door and people saying, oh, you left the women and children in there and made sure you were safe? So the mind is this complex. The emotions are this important. They're taking place all the time. My fear of my anger, my fear of my sadness, my fear of my guilt, my fear of my shame, my fear of my disgust. And I think that has a lot to do with OCD, by the way. Fear of disgust, control of disgust, disgust and disorder being connected there. So I don't just fear the grizzly bear at any given moment in time. When I have fear, I have my relationship to fear that I have to contend with. And we're talking about, you know, the one trial learning or the trauma learning, the chaos learning. So how many people would be willing to deconstruct their fear if they found out the truth that they've been trying to deny their whole life? Like, I'm actually more of a coward than I would ever care to admit. And my fear and my relationship to fear is the proof of it. So in order to not feel shame, this is a particular, you know, single instance I'm talking about. In order to not feel shame, I've got to lie about my fear. If I'm lying about my fear, I'm not well positioned to study it, to examine it, to own it, to claim it, and, you know, and just sort of in good faith address it. I've ruined my own learning opportunity and my own growth opportunity there. And I did so kind of automatically in a way that it will not be easy for me to actually reflect upon and see what it is that I've done. That's a little like putting your glasses on top of your head and then wondering where they are. Other people can perhaps see it, but you have trouble seeing it when they're right there. So the deconstruction process in this kind of situation is complicated, but this is what I'm doing. I'm taking apart the tendrils, the interconnections, and trying to separate them. So you hand me a stew that you call anxiety. I say, are there carrots in it? Is there disgust in it? Is there, you know, potatoes? Is there anger in it? Is there beef? Is there some sadness in it? Like, I'm looking for these interconnections. Because you can't do much with the stew. You can do something pointed, targeted, and effective with the component parts. So let's deal with the sadness. Let's look at the sadness as if it existed independently of those. Let's just look at the sadness. We know it's in the stew. We know it's a parts per million influence in the stew, but we want to know what your relationship is to that component part, and we want to know what your relationship is to the other component parts. Any given point in time, what we're finding out trying to find a slide here. What we're finding out is that it's useful to put what you're afraid of or what your anxiety is connected to into one or more of these categories. So we already talked about trauma. Trauma is a bitch. What can you say about it? Anxiety is guaranteed. And a really confusing stew is also kind of guaranteed. And a strong commitment to avoid all of it is guaranteed. People report when they've been traumatized, early in life, that they often have no memory of their life before it. It's a very common report you hear from people. No memory, like my memories of all that are fuzzy. And there's a reason for that. So the avoidance around the nuclear essence of the trauma is obvious and guaranteed. I can't get close to that nuclear essence. That nuclear essence has, sort of a virtual perimeter that I can sense. I can't get too close to that because that's too close to it. And it's almost like I feel like a glow around it, so I stay away from the glow. Now the glow actually sends out light. So the light I can actually see from something of a distance. This light is pointing to the nuclear thing that I'm trying to avoid. So I need to keep moving back until it gets dark, until I can't see it. Now that's very difficult to do. So I'm always in that horizon where I can begin to see the light and I need to move back further. Now that's like an aura that covers everything in my memory banks. If I'm going to try to look at what happened when I was 3, I've got to fly over what happened when I was 5. So I can't see. It's like eclipsed by this blackout that's created by my avoidance. It's not created directly by the trauma. The trauma is creating the nuclear fallout of all this emotionality. My avoidance is what's causing me to adopt a position as far away as I can possibly get. Because I can't get far enough away, it never leaves me alone. So trauma is very, very difficult. And for that reason alone, you can see why some of the methodologies that people use to work with trauma incorporate an intuitive understanding of this without even actually explicitly understanding it. So we better take it slow, right? We better take off a chunk. We've got to start with recognizing they're resisting and accept some of that. It goes with the territory. So make them safe and comfortable and then explain to them that you're going to have to make them a little bit unsafe and a little bit uncomfortable on purpose. It's just required. It's not unlike the doctor saying, I got to scrub the wound a little bit, which is probably going to hurt, but we've got to get the infection. Like, okay, but it hurts. As long as they have the explanation, they'll put up with some of it, right? This is necessary for your healing. So you bring them into the light part of the trauma where they can actually see, this is where I begin to avoid. This is where I'm uncomfortable. And I say, fine, well, I'll sit next to you. Stay here and be uncomfortable for a while. Longer than you usually do. That's all I want from you. Just stay here longer than you usually do. Now we can go back. Oh, thank you. That wasn't too bad. In the old days, they used an intervention called systematic desensitization to help people with phobias. Mm-hmm. So you're afraid of spiders, you're phobic about spiders, can you handle a picture of a spider? And eventually I want a spider to crawl up your leg and you don't run away. But I can't do that immediately because you'll run away and you won't come back. This guy's a quack, he doesn't know what he's doing. So trauma has to be dealt with kind of systematically from the standpoint of recognizing the initial wounding, like you're talking about, has a nuclear component which factually speaking existed. It existed for your system. Everything else after that, it's sort of debatable whether it's been modified by you, whether you're lying to yourself about it, like you're dressing it up in order to feel more comfortable with it, etc. What we recognize is the pain and the avoidance of the pain have been colluding to make this impossible to get rid of, to resolve. The pain, overwhelming, the avoidance, automatic, like you said. So we're overriding the automatic avoidance by willfully having them move into a space of greater discomfort and more confrontation, more approach toward the center of the cataclysm. At a certain point in time, they're amazed at how far they've come. You can pump them up with the possibility they're getting close. Now they're becoming an ally on the right side of their own resistance. Instead of the cooperative side of resisting, they're now trying to dismantle their own resistance. At that point, the rest of this is almost easy. They just have to be willing to have the experience and tell you and tell themselves what it really means. At some point, they find themselves standing right in the center, like you were talking about, Albert. Really good analogy. Standing right in the center. And they might not say it's a small wind. They'll say it's a giant, terrible wind that knocked me over and gave me a bloody nose and took a loved one from me, whatever. So if I told you some of the traumas that I've worked with, like these things are off the charts. And I think, people would have thought there's no way that you would, like, why would you do that, doctor? And because I could see the outcome. I can see what it produces as an outcome. So I had a woman relive an experience of being stabbed 57 times. I had another young woman relive the experience of the tragic car accident. 3 members of her family were killed when she was 11 years old. And these were life-changing interventions. These are, things that troubled these folks for years and years and years, like gone. And it's not like they forgot that their family died, but all the avoidance, all the Sturm und Drang of the symptom patterns, they now live with the facts. They celebrate the holiday of their loved ones. Still some sadness, still some lingering grief process, but a life that's so much more manageable and not characterized by the trauma. We have temperament. Anybody that has 2 different children recognizes they're born with different temperaments. So, again, you talked about vulnerability. We talked about, we could talk about children's sensitivity. That's a sensitive child. Shyness. It may be that shyness is a predisposition we're born with from birth, which looks a lot like shame, but it's not the same. So there's temperament issues. And, when you're dealing with a client, particularly if they've had trauma, you can't get information about their early childhood before the trauma. They don't know. But that's important because if you started out with a lower threshold to experience fear and a lower tolerance for being able to put up with fear, you're going to be anxiety prone. Plain and simple. You've been sort of cursed by genetics in a sense. And it's a different outcome for folks where it's clearly a temperamental issue. They have to work harder to make progress in terms of conquering their fears. Grief base. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. The idea that grief and losses can be so overwhelmingly painful, it raises anxiety about the prospect of it happening again. And if you get close to somebody, guess what? You're setting up the prospect of great grief. So they become love phobic. And that becomes a secondary source of their dysfunction. They shy away from close relationships. Self-esteem based. Every interpersonal interaction presents the prospect of potential invalidation. Could go that way. You could say something nice to somebody and they decide to spit on you. So, this is part of the reason why people have a public speaking anxiety. Those people often don't have the same kind of anxiety if they're speaking to 7 friends. It's the stranger component. So I know these 7 people won't invalidate me if I stumble on my words or make an ass out of myself or something. The rest of the world, I don't know, I expect them to be cruel. I expect them to be judgmental. It's actually a real fear. There's nothing irrational about that. The social phobia, again, I was talking about shyness a minute ago. What does that come from? If you had some traumatic experiences, you were bullied in seventh grade, you might take social phobia with you the rest of for the rest of your days. If you had a mom or a dad that was afraid of people and human interaction, you had it role modeled for you. Like these could come from different places. Right, modeling, the other one. My mother was just very, very anxious, so I absorbed it or something. I have to sort of figure out I'm not my mother at some point in order to heal that. The existential concerns. This troubles so many people. This is one of those, holographic grizzly bears. Does the idea of my death have to be scary? Well, I don't know. I never think about it. Well, think about that, right? Okay, well, I guess you don't want to talk about it then, do you? Of course not. Why would I want to talk about it? But it doesn't scare me. Okay. Call me when you get triggered, because it's going to happen. And then medical physical issues, which, I think people sort of blithely treat anxiety as if it's always a medical physical issue. And I know you have a more sophisticated understanding than that. But clearly, some sort of brain lesion or, some biochemical mix-up could create all the same, bodily feelings and sensations and internal responses that duplicate the fear of the grizzly bear. And yet there's no grizzly bear. There's just the internal mechanisms that have gone a little haywire. Got to rule that out. The thyroid, right? Somebody's got some thyroid issues, as I understand it. So they're always jittery, Too much coffee, right? And I'm feeling anxious. Well, how many cups of coffee did you have? 7? It's like, well, you're recreating some of the the felt sense of fear. This is also kind of an important issue when it comes to the thrill seeker. Thrill seekers are people who have a kind of experienced fusion between excitement and fear as a bodily experience. So the thrill seeker wants to do something that's exciting. If he adds, 2% fear, it'll make the heart pump even faster and make it feel even more exciting. If he then goes from 2% to 10%, from 10% to 50%, he's now doing things that other people think are really seriously insane. And he's looking for the excitement, but he's crossing the line when it comes to what other people would judge as, taking foolish risks. And he can't get enough because he's sort of addicted to it. The Evel Knievel personality, So this is part of what supports the deconstruction, that I look at these different categories and I'm looking to place, the lion's share of the person's fuzzy fears into one or more of these categories. Then it presents to me the path to resolution. And before we can sort of categorize it like this, we haven't deconstructed it enough to know exactly what it is we're dealing with. So there isn't anxiety. If you want to say there's anxiety, there's anxieties. There's more than one. The job of deconstructing them in each category is slightly different.
If I can interject here for just a second, we are at the end of our scheduled time. Doctors, if you've both got, 10 minutes or so to kind of wrap a ribbon around this, then we'll run over just a little bit just to bring this to a close. But I want to let our viewers know that we are winding down here. So we probably will not get to too many more questions, but certainly we will share those with the doctors and maybe have reason for further conversations down the road. But that said, doctors, if you could kind of, as I said, put a ribbon around this and let's bring this conversation to a close.
We can do that, but I have ribbon anxiety. So
I have to tell you that when you talked about the spider crawling up your leg, I reached down and scratched my leg almost involuntarily.
Exactly. Exactly. So, you want me to go first?
Yes, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know what, my job is to advocate for the efficient and important recognitions of the role that emotions play in creating so much human mischief. And you know, the mind participates in this in part because of this innate preference for ignorance, the comfort of the ignorance in the face of the challenge. If you don't like uncertainty, if you really don't like uncertainty, then I'm certain you're going to become your own worst enemy. If you don't like uncertainty, you won't learn what you need to learn to live well. So I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. This is important for somebody to acknowledge. They come in, they're full of anxiety, and they don't know why. Now they've been told 100 different things. They've got some, you know, preferred fantasies about what it might be or what it must be. And I look at those understandings that they have as more than likely involving a defensive commitment of a certain kind. So if you listen to people when they talk about their anxiety, how much of what they're saying is an effort to save face? And who are they saving face, you know, with or from? Is it with themselves? Is it with certain others? Is it with you? With everybody? If there's moral issues, it could be with God. They're trying to save face with God. You know, help me, please. You know, like there's this frenzy. Help me, please. Help me, please. That's a flag for me when it's that intense. This person's going to have a very, very difficult time slowing down long enough to take a breath and look in the mirror and have an uncontaminated thought. You know, there's going to be like this frenzy and this sort of demand for the, you know, the caretaker figure to make it magically go away. With a client like that, if I can't get them to slow down, I'm very likely to refer them immediately to a psychiatrist, because they are not a candidate for self-exploration. They just want to feel better. And if I don't make them feel better quickly, I'll be fired. So I'll resign before I get fired. But that's important to me, like that initial presentation, because it says so much about where they've drawn some conclusions about what it is that they're wrestling with. And they're not really comfortable being uncertain, even though they are clearly uncertain. So I don't act like the answer man. I don't want to be delivering answers, and I don't want to be seen as, you know, you put $1 in and an answer comes out. That makes this effort on their part too passive and too simplistic. I actually want them to be more of a scientist or philosopher in the moment. Like, let's pause and let's think about this. Let's take it apart. Let's not immediately get under the covers. Let's examine the room before we get under the covers, right? If there's a boogeyman in the closet, you know what we ought to do is open the closet door. It's the last thing they want to do, but that's what, you know, let's think about it. Tell you what, I'll open the closet first, right?
And Mike, go ahead, sorry.
Well, you know, so this is all education about who we are as emotional creatures. That's really what it sort of boils down to me.
What intrigues me, Mike, is that during this conversation, somehow my mind is on family. And what's fascinating to me is that most parents employ this exact technique in raising children.
Yeah.
Our children come to us as vulnerable little creatures, upset over what we consider to be tiny things because we've been through those little fires, have come out the other side and realized they're nothing. And we try to reassure our children, step into what looks like a smoke, what looks like a fire, and realize it's not even a trickle of a match. It's nothing. And we reassure them step by step by step. And how do we engage our children from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood and even beyond? It's through the level of our own experience where we are sharing with them, come toward the problem, work your way through it and realize the mountain is not even a molehill.
Yeah.
It's much less than that.
Yeah.
But then when it's time for us to move through those same challenges, we tend to shy away, forgetting
Yeah. Yeah.
our training and how we seek to train our children and the rest of our family.
Yeah.
So in one respect, we're powerful. We are a pillar of strength for our children and for others around us. But we forget, as we move through these different challenges, the same process that actually works. We have to step back and take a look and really invest in understanding what's going on. From a biochemical perspective, I like to talk about undermethylators a lot, and I like to talk about overmethylators a lot. Undermethylators are highly targeted individuals who will go straight to the core of the problem to assess it so they can come out on the other side academically as victorious champions,
Yes.
honor roll individuals, straight A candidates. They
Yeah.
can't do that without going to assess every single aspect of the problem at hand, coming up with a solution, and then moving forward. And their reward is success. This is the kind of approach that needs to be continued. And why do I bring up undermethylators first? Because most of the time, these are the typical individuals who have these kind of severe panic attack issues,
Yeah.
and severe anxiety and so forth. On the other side of the equation are the overmethylators. Here, they don't have a pattern for problem solving. They're strong in creating a solution where there was none before. Yet when they have these trials of fear and anxiety, part of it maybe is that they have a lack of real understanding or consideration because they haven't looked at the problem long enough. They're so used to having a very free and quick and clear pathway created by themselves to answer the problem or to solve the mystery, that when it gets a little bit tougher or it gets more personal, they shy away from their, as you would say, the vulnerability of what if I'm not creative enough to solve the problem. So we still end up in sort of the same pathway of a lack of going to the central core of the issue in order to come out on the other side. Yet it's the same way that we actually treat and help our children grow as parents. So mom and dads out there, think about it. Are you doing what it is that you're asking your children to do? Are you doing what it is that your parents showed you would come through as you developed and continuing that pathway?
And to me, just not to interrupt, but that says something about novelty. So you're young, everything's novel. I haven't been there yet. Now you're older, there's still a lot of novel situations. And yet we act as if there's nothing I don't know about or haven't been. The truth is I face new and different every day, not as much as I did when I was a child, but it still happens. And I bring the child's vulnerability to that challenge rather than the adult learning and the adult recognition. And so, yeah, after doing this for a lot of years, you go, oh yeah, there I am avoiding again, stop avoiding, you can sort of self-police, and do better at it. But it does take practice, because that fear thing, when it grips you and it says run, and we don't, it's not really, Mother Nature didn't say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you all guys a pause button. You can just, hit it and say, do I want to run or do I want to think twice about this? No, you're running. It's, fear is that powerful. Mother Nature knew what she was doing in that sense. Think about it, it has to be instantaneous. Like, imagine the gazelles at the watering hole, the first gazelle jumps, they're all gone, It's like nobody's having a conference about it. Like I just have this picture of the gazelles, the more mature ones running in the back, a little more slowly, and they're talking to each other. And it's like, this was nervous Ned again, huh? Taking off, right? Yeah, afraid so. Nervous Ned. He's always the first one to run, Damn him! Like I bet he wasn't even a lion in the first place. Nah, probably not.
But look at that, Mike, right there. And this is my last analogy, Mr. Wells. The predator, on the other hand, studies the situation, studies the prey from every angle, whether it's out in nature with the lion and the gazelle, or a very patient man looking to gain that special someone, taking the time to learn about that individual, understand, assess, and then move through the program and the process. So in many ways, there are a lot of analogies to this situation. Mike, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge and your wisdom base, and what it is that you do and how you do it. And I want to thank Mr. Wells and everyone who's come to the webinar for some insight as we are all continually learning in this process together. Mr. Wells.
Absolutely. And one important thing to point out is both from the mind and the body side, the orthomolecular and the psychiatry or psychology side, there is hope. Both of these approaches are effective in helping people, and certainly our focus with the Integrative Mental Health Summit and the series of conversations is talking about doing these things in an integrative fashion, making sure that we're making use of all the resources that are available so that we can indeed all do a better job of healing and helping and thriving and surviving. So thanks to both of you for your insight today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We got a couple of notes asking how to get in touch with our good Dr. Lukens here. Of course, most of you know how to get in touch with us at Mensah Medical, but we will make sure that when we post this video replay on the Amity website, that we'll have information on how to contact Dr. Lukens and to contact us at Mensah Medical as well. A reminder, if you want to revisit this conversation or if you want to share this conversation with friends and family, go to journeysdream.org/Amity. There you'll be able to access the Amity website and all of our webinars that we've been hosting over the course of these last several months will be there for you to take part in. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you next month.
Thanks for having me. See you again.
Thank you.